When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Mid-Atlantic region and beyond. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything, from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 295 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with water gardening enthusiast Dr. Peter Kramers about Color on the Creek's solution for managing stormwater and algal blooms. The plant profile is on wine cups, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on the parsnip and the peanut from Christy Page of Green Prints.
This episode, we're joined by Dr. Peter Kramers. He is the co-founder of Color in the Creek. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. And we're going to talk all about that wonderful water gardening project in downtown Frederick, Maryland. But before we dive into that, Peter, we want to talk about you and your background. And were you born with chlorophyll in your vein and a green thumb?
I love that question. I think if I have the gene, it's probably a latent gene. I mean, I remember very well at maybe age 8 being given a little plot of land that my neighbor had and a rototiller, which was probably bigger than I was. And I wrestled with this rototiller for 3 or 4 days and just kept churning the soil and picking up rocks and little pieces of gravel. I mean, I had this stuff down to like a sand. I still to this day don't remember what I planted in there. It was probably a vegetable garden. But I just remember the process of making this rich black soil and in preparation for the vegetable garden. And then I guess my next strong recollection is I used to help my grandparents with their farm outside of Milwaukee in Wisconsin. And they had the usual pigs and chickens and dairy cows, but they also had a very large garden, which we used to supply the evening meal for these folks that were living there, old folks' home. We had like 5 or 6 residents, and I still love the smells and remember what it was like in the rhubarb patch and the strawberry patch, and we had corn and peas and all the other things you might think about in a typical garden. And then I didn't do much. I kind of got lost in my medical training, so that was probably another 20 years of my life, and there wasn't a lot of spare time. But about 30 years later, in 2001, I put a small addition on my home and wrapped a water garden around that home. And it was probably 14,000 gallon pond. And I learned through a lot of trial and error with some advice from the local center, which happened to be Lily Ponds, John Sander, and then Suzanne Bloom, and with their advice and just a lot of making mistakes, I learned a lot about what to do and what not to do in a water garden, and especially dealing with algae, which is kind of something that all people who have a water garden deal with at one point or another, and it can be a vexing problem. So that was kind of, I guess, my introduction and my preparation for what came later with Color on the Creek.
And describe where you're located and kind of those growing conditions.
So Frederick, Maryland is just north of DC, west of Baltimore. We're I think we're 7A at this point in time. And it's an interesting climate. Maryland is kind of has a mercurial climate, I would say, with slight warming over the years and punctuated with really occasionally really cold winters, right? So it's what we ultimately have learned is that it's not really conducive, obviously, to tropical plants, but yet that's something that most water gardeners in our area want to have just because they're so prolific and the different colors and night blooming aspects. So, but that's Maryland. It's a kind of a fun climate, I guess.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite lines ever on The Daily Show was, "Why can't we all be like Maryland?" They were talking about severe weather all over and wildfires here and hurricanes there. We get the occasional hurricane, which we'll talk about in a second. And Frederick is also kind of the foothills of some little, we will call it a little mountain range, right at that point.
Yeah.
It's got some rolling hills. And it's kind of the triangle on 70 from equidistant almost from Baltimore to DC. So a lot of people move out there for the small town feel, but it is a little city.
Right. Yeah, we're currently the second largest city now in Maryland and growing very rapidly and have all the usual things you think about with the urban environment in Frederick. So it's an interesting place.
Mm-hmm. And so if anybody has been to downtown Frederick in the last 10 years or so, you might have wandered down and saw a beautiful water garden called Color in the Creek that runs down the center of it. But we're going to wind back to how that got established, and that was channeling Carroll Creek due to some storms and flooding. So can you give some background on that weather events that affected Frederick, Maryland?
Sure. So actually, the organization's called Color on the Creek.
Oh, on the creek,
oh,
sorry. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so in 1972 we had Hurricane Agnes, and in 1976 we had a very large rain event, an unnamed tropical storm. And basically, what happened was there was fairly significant flooding from the Carroll Creek, which runs right through the heart of Frederick, and it caused $60 million in damage. This then led to a fairly large effort to create a water control project, which became the Carroll Creek Linear Park. So it had really two functions. One was to control these waters and divert the flow actually underground through these four large subterranean conduits that hold 6 million gallons of water. But
Wow.
it brought the water from the watershed in the west underground, bypassing the city, and then ultimately it flows downstream into the Monocacy and the Chesapeake Bay. And this was very successful in terms of bringing all the adjoining properties out of the floodplain. And FEMA actually technically declared that we were out of the floodplain. So this allowed for economic development. The other aspect of this, which was intended, was that this was going to be a linear park, which allowed for pedestrian traffic from old historic Frederick to East Frederick, or what's called East Frederick Rising. And it's really beautiful. There are these large, wide promenades which sit atop of those conduits. You don't see them, obviously. Mm-hmm. And there's amphitheaters and restaurants and things that are flanking the Carroll Creek waterway. There's like an artificial waterway in the middle of these four conduits, and that's what you actually see when you come to Frederick. And the problem became evident over time. So the project, I think, was probably finished in 2006, but over the next 6 to 10 years, the nutrients were building up in the creek because it's a very slow flow. In other words, during the dry season, the natural flow of the creek to the west in the watershed was not sufficient to keep the flow moving quickly. And so this is typical in a lot of lakes and ponds where, if you have a stagnant body of water, the nutrients build up, and it's accelerated in our case by paddocks and agricultural runoff to the west. So all these nutrients are pouring in, the flow is stagnant, and then we have sunlight galore because of the conduits, you couldn't plant trees along the banks, right? You couldn't establish a riparian barrier. There's no way. So you have sunlight, stagnant flow, and a lot of nutrients. And when you do that, when you combine those elements, you're going to get algae. It's just unavoidable. And that's the situation we found ourselves in 2012 when we started this whole journey, if you want to call it that.
And it's sounding a little familiar, Peter, for a situation that's happening on the National Mall right now.
Yeah.
And we should say that we know each other also through the International Water Garden Society. We're both members, and I am an editor of their quarterly journal, the Water Garden Journal. And Peter has written an article on Color on the Creek for it, and we'll put the link for that in our show notes as well. So we're both water gardening enthusiasts, and we're going to talk a lot about water gardening and some of the solutions for algae blooms in this episode. But we should also acknowledge that IWGS has so many experts worldwide. I highly recommend joining that organization. We'll put that link to IWGS also in the show notes, but it's just iwgs.org. And you mentioned briefly consulting with Lily Ponds, which is a world famous water gardening business that was in the area. And Suzanne Boom, who now works for Longwood Gardens, used to work there. John Sanders, who now works for Glenstone, worked there. And unfortunately, it closed recently. And I have to say, it's a tragedy, Peter.
Yeah, I really miss them being here. When I have a problem, I text John, as you mentioned, he's down at Glenstone, or Suzanne, or Tim Jennings, who works with Suzanne up at Longwood Gardens now. And the flow of information and just the willingness to help, it wasn't just instrumental in getting us rolling, because at that time, it was John I was dealing with. And, in terms of plant selection and just some general advice, because I have no formal training in, botany or aquaculture or horticulture as part of my life, but they are just an incredible resource. And like you mentioned, the IWGS with all their articles and just experts that can give you advice was really instrumental, I think, in allowing us to succeed ultimately. So.
And in the show notes, I also had interviewed Suzanne on water gardening, plants and basics, and another local water gardening legend, Kelly Billing. We did an episode with her on Lotus. So I'll have both of those episodes linked in our show notes for those who want to dive in. That's my pun for the day, Peter.
Okay.
To dive into water gardening even more, I highly recommend those episodes. But let's describe the situation that you started with. So the main channel that we're looking at, that everybody calls Carroll Creek, that's kind of funneled into it, right? Is it a concrete bottom? Is it brick on the side? What are the materials we're looking at?
So it has a concrete bottom, and then there's a layer of benite clay, because concrete is porous. So to prevent it from leaking, you put the clay down. And then, for reasons that aren't clear, they put all this boulder, this what's called riprap, anywhere from 6 inches to 3 or 4 feet in diameter. My guess is they thought it would look more like a natural stream bottom, but I've never really uncovered the reason behind that. And then the sides are actually beautiful stonework. It's about, the whole area is probably almost 3 miles long, this center waterway. The part that runs through the heart of Frederick that we treat is about 3/8 of a mile long, I would say, a little over a quarter of a mile for sure. And it varies in depth, but generally somewhere between 3.5 and maybe 5 feet. And the water level really doesn't change. Even with a big rainstorm, the water the floodwaters spill over these weirs, these walls in the water to the west towards the watershed. And so almost all that excess water flows into those big tunnels. And the flow in the creek itself does not really change. And the reason, I know this is when I first started this in 2012, it was that year we put a test garden in, and Hurricane Sandy went right over the top of Frederick, right? And so I'm downtown with my waders because I was attending a hurricane party, right? And so I had my waders, and I got in the creek more, I guess, as a photo op, but just to show that the water wasn't, even though there was wind, the water, the volume, the speed was not really changed. And that's important because if you're talking about building a water garden, you know, water lilies in general don't like fast flow. They can tolerate a little bit, but you don't want to build it in the middle of a flowing creek or a stream. But ours was more like a pond. In truth, we have some flow, but it's fairly limited, and that was kind of something I used to try and explain this to people who were a little bit skeptical, reasonably skeptical about the whole idea of starting a water garden there.
Yeah, I think 3.5 feet is almost the ideal for a backyard water garden or depth, because that's what water lilies and most plants like a lot, although lotuses and some others are more shallow, like
Correct.
marginal plants. So
Right.
we'll talk about the differences and how you planted those. But I always wondered about that water level, because when I'm walking along it, it looks deep. It looks like if I fall in, it would be more than 5 feet at some places.
Yeah, no, there are very few. There are a few, I don't know, holes. I'm not sure why they're there, so to speak, where it's a little bit deeper. Might be 5.5, but most of it's 3 to 4 feet. I would say is the 90% of it. So, and you're right. So, certain plant materials want certain depths. So, water lilies you can plant down to 5 feet, and and really almost up to the surface. Even with 18 inches of water above the top of the pot would be okay. But for a lot of the bog plants, the emergent plants like lotus and pickerel rush and thalia, a lot of those types of plants, if you have 8 inches below the water, you're going to drown the plant. So we had to devise a system to place the plant material at the correct depth, and that was a bit challenging because the depth of the creek where where we put the water garden in varies a bit. So we basically designed these metal stands, which would then accommodate either 18 or larger 48 quart pots, and then we would literally cut the length of the stand to the specific place we wanted in the creek, and that was really actually a pretty challenging part because I mean 2 feet away it could vary, so that was a little problem. But we solved that, I think, and in general, with the exception of the bog plants, the smaller pots for the tropical lilies and things that we use, the tropical lilies, we can move those around, and the depth is not nearly as critical, I would say.
And how did you anchor those and stop them from tipping over or falling over?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So the first year in 2012, we put a test garden in, and I had built these columns out of cinder blocks, but they're not very stable. And by the time you get them up 3 or 4 feet off the bottom, if there's any angulation, they fall over. So what we realized quickly during that test garden is we needed a better system. So we developed these stands are made of iron, and they're basically a three-legged stand with a couple of rings at the top that the pot sits in. And so a tripod is pretty stable by itself by design. And then when you add the fact that once you put the pot in the water, you have the buoyancy effect. The pot, whatever amount of water it displaces, reduces the likelihood it's going to tip over. So we rarely get things that tip over. We did develop some tripod stands where we link 3 of them together, and we did this primarily for the emergent plants that have a lot of windage, like canna and thalia, because they can go 5-6 feet above the water, or sometimes even the palms can be 10 feet above the water. And with the 50-mile-an-hour wind, it's more likely to topple. But if you take 3 of these stands and make a large tripod, that spans 7 feet, it's almost impossible to tip that stand over. So we, again, a lot of trial and error, but that's what we came up with as the solution. So.
I think that's a great solution, because I can imagine, as most water gardeners and anybody who's ever taken a bath knows, if you had just floating planters all along, they would all end up gathering into one corner or one little stretch on the side, and it wouldn't be as nice of an effect. And I was wondering, are they tethered by a chain or a rope? But if they're heavy and sitting at the bottom, that's even better.
Yeah. And just when I first started looking at what was on the internet, what I could buy, I didn't find anything that was really suitable. So that's why we had to design, and we fabricated our own, stands using Frederick Community College has an industrial program, and Toby Mendez, the sculptor, and a guy named Pete Markey who has a little firm. And so for like $50, or maybe it was $30 a stand, we were building these at scale, like 500 of them. So that was the first initial expense, but it just sort of took bringing some people in our community together to help us do things that we just couldn't do. So, and that worked out really well.
And I know a lot of Color in the Creek is volunteers helping doing those plantings every spring. And most of these plants do need to be taken out and overwintered, correct? Are you taking everything out at the end of the season?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, first of all, we are a 501c3. We have 0 paid staff. This entire project was volunteer supported and run. We do get, help from the city in terms of controlling water levels, which we can actually do in the creek, but it's basically all funded privately, and it's not really that expensive. It's like year over year about a $13,000 budget, and that involves to pay for the plants and the fertilizer and the tropical and as well as the perennial plants. In terms of what we leave in and take out, I would say 90% of the material in the creek stays in the creek through the winter. The only thing that we don't try to overwinter, or the only thing that we don't keep in, are the tropical plants. So we have probably 300 tropical lilies planted this year, and we probably have another, 100 or so tropical bog plants, so canna and a few other things. But most of what you're looking at are perennial lilies and perennial bog plants. To move these containers out of the creek, the large container might weigh in excess of 250 pounds all in when you have and so physically it'd be really difficult. And so we basically the only thing we really have to turn over frequently are the tropicals, and they're in a smaller 19-quart pot, so it's not that bad. But as you said, we have hundreds, and we've had 1,000 volunteers easily over the years, and most of our work sessions we probably have 60 to 80 people come and help us, and we have probably 4 major work sessions throughout, cleaning up the creek in the spring, and then fertilizing the perennial plants, and then we plant a little greenhouse where we get some of our tropicals rooted and established. We bring everything over to the creek usually the last week in June, from the greenhouse, and we also plant some bare root then. So this year it was the end of June, and then the next work session is when we put the garden to bed, which is usually sometime in early October, early to mid-October.
So, Peter, one of my loves and I think the best benefits of water gardening is it's almost set it and forget it, right? Being in season. Yeah. There's not watering every day like we're doing in our heat and drought in the summertime a lot. So the water's already there. You don't have to water. And weeding is at a minimum. But I'm imagining there is a little bit of maintenance, say, I don't know, some giant thistle pops up in the middle of a planter.
Yeah, what we do, if you look at a typical water garden and you have like water lilies, they're almost always going to recommend that you fertilize that plant, every 10 days to 2 weeks, these little tabs and things. So for us, that would be nearly impossible because we have well in excess of 500 big pots at this point in time. So what we've done in terms of the maintenance aspect is we use a fertilizer. It's basically like Nutricoat, Florican, but it's basically a prill with a very slow release, accurate release fertilizer. And you can buy these in different formulations, 90 days, 120 days, even out to 2 or 3 years. And the beauty of that is, number one, the fertilizer is actually used by the plant. Sometimes with the tabs, by the time you get it under the water column into the plant, it's already dissolving to mush. And I don't know, I've never seen any data, but I'm going to guess that 70% of that of the fertilizer ends up in the water column, and the plant can't take it up quickly enough. And then you're actually helping you're feeding the algae problem, right? Or could be.
Yep.
So by using this very controlled release fertilizer, we can fertilize once a year and we're done. We're not having to be in that creek all the time trying to fertilize this. The only exception to that is we can talk about this more in depth later, but we have Victorias, which they do require a high level of fertilization. They're very heavy feeders, but everything else is just fertilized once a year, whether it's the new tropicals or the perennials. And that has really helped with the maintenance aspect. But the only other maintenance we do, as you say, there's no real, you don't have to worry about watering, and we do trim them a little bit to keep them looking nicer. It doesn't really affect the health of the plant, but it's that way you don't have to look at the dead lilies. It's a normal process where the lily pads will, as they get older, they turn yellow and they die and they drop into the creek. And so we try and trim those just to keep it looking not like Longwood Gardens, or other great water gardens of the world, Kew Gardens, but at least it does clean it up a bit, and I think it's just more pleasant to look at. I think besides that, occasionally we have some pests, the caterpillars that can attack a lotus, but it's not nearly, I think, as difficult as terrestrial gardening. I think there's a lot more pests that you have to worry about.
Definitely. I would say you would probably have the occasional bird, plucking off things or dropping some droppings, and that's maybe where some weeds might pop up, is from a bird dropping. But otherwise, you're pretty good. It's pretty low maintenance. And I wanted to ask about the planting medium that you're using. So you described those like iron troughs that you created. Do you have like a coconut coir lining? What is stopping the medium from going through? Is it a heavy mud? Because frankly, that's what most water garden plants grow in, is a thick clay or mud.
Right. Yeah. So actually, it's a metal stand with rings which support a plastic pot. These are the standard pots you can buy online. There's lots of different vendors, but they're a thick. I don't know if it's neoprene. I'm not sure what it's made of, but it's just a thick plastic. And we just use two different sizes, keep things simple. And then what we use is, like you mentioned, you want to use like heavy clay, and the more organic things that you have in there, that will all dissolve, and the volume of the soil in the pot will diminish rapidly. So you just want to get, clay, basically, as you say. That's what everything likes. And so it's very simple. And the only thing we add to that clay, as I say, is the fertilizer, which are little pellets we put at the bottom. And then that slowly, over time, ekes into the soil, and then the plant can pick it up. Yeah.
And so most of these are perennial plants that are hardy, that you're just leaving in. They die back at the end of fall. You're probably cutting them back. And are you replenishing any of that soil, like scooping out the old and adding in new each year? Or that just sounds like a horrible job to do?
I hate that you asked me that question, because it's kind of embarrassing. Like if you look out in the creek, there are some plants that are mounded up, and that's because they're root bound. And when that happens, like there's probably at least one or two pots in there that were placed in 2012. Most people talk about dividing lilies every, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, and maybe the lotus every 2 years. But it's such a huge job in terms of labor. So we've taken another approach, and this sounds kind of lazy, but when things get root bound, what happens is they become very buoyant, and they literally float out of the pots, and then we drag them out of the creek. Sometimes we'll cut them and then replant them, and sometimes it's just easier for us to replant in a new large pot. And this is, I wouldn't do it this way if, I had paid staff and things like that. But these, as I said, to pull one of these pots out, it could easily weigh 250 pounds. So what we actually do is that in the fall, the plants that are clearly root bound, we bring in like booms, which are it's like a tractor with an extended boom, and or regular tractors with hooks, and we use that mechanical aid to pull these things out of the water, and then we just compost it. Because most of these water plants, as you probably know, they're almost all water themselves. So there isn't a lot of value in trying to turn it into methane or to recycle it.
Yeah, I find, Peter, that compost is like gold. Anything I pull from my water garden that I can just even just throw as a top dressing around other plants. It's got the good fish poop, it's got the good nutrients in it. So it is the best compost addition that I have.
Yeah, yeah.
And speaking of fish poops, are there any fish that you've, or other creatures that you've added? So sometimes we have those mosquito eating fish or decorative koi, or have some just, been added by other people. I've seen that happen in public water gardens as well.
Yeah. When we first started, to be honest, the only fish I saw in there were these large carp. They're like 3.5 feet long. They're kind of ugly, dark, kind of a dark gray, almost black.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, as the water quality improved, and it improved dramatically with the planting of the water garden for a number of reasons, but the oxygen levels went up, and then we started seeing, panfish, bluegills, sunfish. There are a lot of smallmouth bass in the Carroll Creek now. There's also a lot of like pretty koi, and these have come from, I think, people from when their own ponds get overrun with koi, or some of the golf courses that have these ponds, they actually put the koi into the creek. This isn't something I've ever done, but I know it's being done.
Yeah, I suspected that.
It's actually pretty interesting to go down there and look at the fish. And the kids, they don't really care about the flowers so much, right? But they come down and they'll stare at the koi and the bass forever. So it's kind of fun, but that clearly was something that changed once we changed the water quality, because it was very anaerobic, and we had the only thing that would grow actually under these big algae mats that developed, these big algae blooms, were things like hydrilla and duckweed. I mean, because hydrilla it's a very invasive plant, and it can outcompete everything else. And that's pretty much disappeared, in part because we're restricting the sunlight available by planting maybe 60% of the surface of the water garden, I guess, is about what I would estimate now, and that's cut out the sunlight so that you don't see the hydrilla. And we have a little bit of duckweed in the spring before the water garden starts to roll, but even that has been diminishing significantly, I would say, over the last 4 or 5 years. So.
Mm-hmm. And that's the key, really, to water garden balance is there's always going to be that early spring algae flush before the water garden plants start to grow and expand and the water lily pads cover the surface. You're always going to have that, and people panic, and then they add like an additive that can knock back the algae in their water gardens. But I always say just wait 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And you don't need to add that. It'll balance itself. So maybe we might tell the people down on the National Mall at the reflecting pool
Well,
that they could have waited a little bit. But I think they're not obviously going to add plant material to cover the reflecting, because it's a reflective surface. But
right.
they could easily add a dark dye to it.
Right. And that's when we first looked at our project, we studied them all. Right. I went down there and I kind of read through what was going on, and it's been a recurring problem ever since whenever. And they had done a huge renovation of the mall back in, I think it was 2012. Actually, it was the first year that we started, and there were all these complaints and articles in the Washington Post about the algae blooms. They'd spent $50 million and they still had algae. And the problem is, when you take a body of water like that and you have all this sunlight, and it's relatively stagnant flow, whatever you do, I think unless you create a water garden, which, as you say, would not be conducive to a reflecting pond, there are other ways. I mean, you can put in certain chemicals that lock up phosphorus, for instance, which is a critical nutrient. There's something called phospholock. There's a number of different things. Or you can't, if you can't shade from trees or surface plants, the other way is to shade the water column from within, and that's why black and dark water, black, blue, green dyes, which are just inert vegetable dye, very safe, they can really make a difference. And if you think about the Masters golf tournament, you see it on TV, and those ponds look beautiful. There's no algae. They look like mirrors. You can see the sky and the trees reflected. Those are just black water dyes. Almost all of the large, beautiful water gardens in the world, like Longwood and Kew, they use black dyes as well. And I think, nobody asked me, but if I was going to look at that, I would kind of wonder why. Because for $200 worth of dye, you could dye that whole reflecting pond black. Now, maybe they don't like that idea because you can't see the bottom, but actually, I think it's really kind of beautiful. But every body of water is different. Some people have more inflow of nutrients than others. Some people, they're different microclimates, if you will, for the body of water you're studying. And I think you have to take all of those things into consideration, as well as what's the ultimate goal. What do you want that body of water to look like if you're trying to, create an artificial thing like the reflecting pond, or, and to be honest, our color in the creek, or the Carroll Creek itself, is an artificial construct, right? I mean, it what is there now is nothing like the natural stream that predated it. So you just have to look at the different options, and sometimes it's superficial and deep aeration. Sometimes it's new technologies where you can inject ozone and air or oxygen into these micro bubbles, which and by doing that, you're increasing the oxygen content, and this allows the beneficial bacteria to thrive, and they then outcompete the algae. So the vast majority of the algae that we're seeing in our creek, and I presume on the Mall and Lake Erie, is cyanobacter. They call it blue-green algae. It's really a bacteria, right? It's a gram-negative bacteria. It's what started the whole Earth rolling, right? It through chlorophyll pigments, it allowed the harnessing of sunlight and water to make oxygen, right? And this was critical. And so that particular bacteria, I would say, is responsible for 90% of the water algae blooms that we see today. And so anything you can do to outcompete it or to limit its growth, so you can starve it of nutrients, or you can shade it. If you put a blanket over the Mall or over our creek, there would be no sunlight, and therefore there would be no photosynthesis, and there would be no algae. But it does go in cycles, and it's interesting. I mean, sometimes you can have all the things that you would expect to cause a bloom, like nutrients, sunlight, stagnant flow, and you don't get a bloom, and then all of a sudden you get one, and then it goes away. To your point, and sometimes it's kind of hard to predict the cycles, but it's clearly a massive problem, and it's a growing problem worldwide, especially in coastal areas now, like along the coast of China and other places, along the coast of the Great Lakes at times, because you get this nitrogen, which is going into the marine environment. So if you think about like freshwater, typically phosphorus is the limiting nutrient, but in salt water, it's nitrogen. So what happens is you get, industrial production of nitrogen, you have wastewater from human waste, fish farming, chickens, whatever. When that nitrogen comes into the saltwater environment, then the algae have their missing ingredient, nitrogen. So it's just worldwide, it's a huge problem, and I think and the solutions are different, right? I mean, you can try to limit the point source, or where it's coming from, or you can make a barrier, like you see along the creeks in Frederick County and all throughout the world. They're building these riparian barriers of trees, which will absorb the nutrients, cool the water before it can get into the streams and creeks and lakes.
Yep.
That's it's just an interesting. And there's a great book. I think we were talking about this earlier, Slime, by Ruth Kassinger, who's kind of has this whole thing about algae, and I think the subtitle was How Algae Created Us. They plague us and might just save us, or something. There's some obviously, but it's a good book, and if you want to dive deeper, I would recommend it.
Yeah, and that title again is Slime, as in like slime mold, or being slimed on Nickelodeon. I'm sure people of that generation recall that. And yeah, the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool has lessons for us all, I think. But back to the Color on the Creek project, I wanted to ask you about particular plants and what worked and didn't work, especially for such a large-scale public garden project, which it is.
Well, for the bog plants, we used a lot of typical plants like thalia, which is native to Maryland, pickerel rush. We used some bulrush, even cattails. We also added in some tropicals, the palms, cypress palm, Egyptian palm, because they
Mm-hmm.
have great height. And we're trying to create, environments with interest based on not just the colors and the texture, but also the heights above the water of various plant materials. And, to be honest, I can't think of anything in terms of a bog plant that hasn't worked. In terms of the lilies, we use a lot of just perennial lilies that, you can get at any supplier, like Texas Star for yellows, or there's there are literally, I don't know, 400 or 500 that you can get through places like Florida Aquatics and others, or through their distributors. And I don't think we've had any particular plant that didn't do well, with the exception of when we first started to grow or attempt to grow the Victorias, because they require a lot more heat. They're used to water temperatures in the mid 80s to 90 degrees probably. And when we tried them, I think maybe out of the first 4 years, I got blooms maybe once. And it's in that particular plant is kind of like the holy grail for water gardeners, because the pads can reach up to 10 feet, like for the Victoria Boliviana. There's really four different. There's really three that are kind of commercially available. You get Victoria Cruziana, Victoria Amazonica. You can get the Longwood Cross, which is between Victoria Cruziana and Victoria Amazonica. And then there's a new one, this Victoria Boliviana, which is just described
Mm-hmm.
recently by one of the members of IWGS. But that one I don't think is commercially available. In fact, I don't even think Longwood or Q have it as yet. I'm not sure, but that's the last time I talked to Tim and Suzanne about it. I don't think they had access yet. So, but this particular plant, because it is used to growing in the Amazon River Basin, and it's very, like, if the water temperature is below 80, it will not thrive. And you really want to get the water temperature above 80. If it's below 70, you'll kill it. So we had to develop a special kind of a container apparatus that would heat the soil itself, not the water, but the soil that the plant is in, to about 90 degrees. And once we did that, we started having great results. It's kind of like a double boiler. It's got a very thin 1 to 2 inch jacket of water, which we heat with a $40 aquarium heater. It's got a temperature probe, and it heats it to that temperature. And within a day or two, the soil, which is on the inner pot, goes to 90 degrees or whatever you set it at. And it's a very cheap way to do this. I mean, it's when I first started looking into this, a lot of the experts in the field started saying, "Wow, you're wasting your time. It's not going to work." And I don't know. I think we're all experts to some extent, but we also realize we got to be experts by making a lot of mistakes and trying things that didn't work out. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you just can't be in our circle, whether you're on land or on water with these plants, you always have to take the published literature and what the so-called experts say with a grain of salt, because we're all, our own experience of has sort of is what it is. And I think it's important that you try different things, even if it doesn't sound like it should work. Like I've mentioned, I've seen you on other podcasts where people talking about using plants in different zones that they shouldn't have worked, but they did, right, for one reason or another. And I think there's a lot of that. And I think so. My advice is don't be afraid to fail. To try something, and at worst you look like an idiot for a couple of days, but nobody cares.
I think that's great advice, Peter. And the Victoria water lilies, for those who haven't seen them in person, they are extraordinary. At Longwood, they have, 10, 12 feet diameter. And there's always that famous picture of a little girl standing on one. They don't do that anymore. They don't put small children on the pads, but they are extraordinary water lilies, and great that you're getting them to thrive in Color on the Creek, because I think that is amazing. And I know one of your biggest challenges was a little creature that we don't encounter too much in our gardens in the area, and that's the muskrat. Can you describe what they were doing to the plantings, and then what your solution was?
Great question. Painful. So I think we planted the full water garden in 2013. The following year, in 2014, none of the lotus were coming up. And it turned out that we'd had this family of muskrats that decided to overwinter in this fountain right in the center of the garden off to the side. And they devoured all of the tubers. So lotus tubers, they're really a food source in most of the world, lotus soup and things like that. But so they're protein rich, and evidently the muskrats can smell this like in parts per million, a mile away, like a shark can smell blood. And they devoured every lotus tuber, so we had to start over. So these creatures are kind of interesting. They look like a rat with long fingernails, and they breed like crazy, and they just eat, So they destroyed the lotus part of the planting. So we ended up building these cages first on top, and now we have like a metal cage with like 2 by 2 inch grid pattern that we just drop into the pot on top of the soil. And this allows the leaves to grow up through those large gaps, but the muskrats can't dig down through that metal grid. And so that was our solution to the muskrats. And then in addition to that, I mentioned we have these massive koi and carp and other fish that are constantly trying to uproot the plants. And our solution to that was to just use pond liner, which you can buy inexpensively on the internet. Mm-hmm. And we just made like a donut. So it would fit down into the pot on top of the soil with a little hole in the center. And we would plant our lilies and other plants like that in the center of that hole. We hold the pond liner down with these little biodegradable stakes that you can also buy online, like 500 of them for $20 or whatever. And that holds the rubber liner down. But this prevents the fish from getting to the soil, because when they try and, we used to use gravel and even fairly large rocks, like an inch in diameter. But these large fish can just pick those up, spit them out, and they will get to the soil. But using this rubber liner, they just bounce off of it, because they can't chew into it. And so that has reduced. We used to lose, I would say, 30% of our plant material to this uprooting, which is a real problem. You see these things floating down the creek, and you go back and you try and hand plant them. But ever since we adapted that little, call it a hack or whatever you want, it's really improved that dramatically. We still have a few things that uproot for one reason or another, but that really kind of solved the problem of the fish attacking. And I use that in my own water garden. I mentioned I have this little water garden at my house, and I kind of use it as a laboratory, mm-hmm. because I've got like 70 large koi in there, and there's only about 20 plants. So there's a lot of pressure, fish pressure on those plants. And this is actually has allowed me to devise some of these little solutions. And it's the nice thing about this is all this material, or what we do, is very cheap and inexpensive. So I think for people who want to have fish and plants together, it's an easy hack, and I think you'll see it's nice because you don't get the fish storing up the soil, and it changes the water clarity obviously when they're in there rooting around, spawning or whatever they're doing, and it's just an easy fix.
Yeah, I think that's ingenious, Peter, because I've seen people use like pool noodles, kind of like around like the styrofoam, almost looking pool noodle, wrap it around the plantings as a barrier, but it's not that pretty, or doesn't blend it as much as it could. So I think that's a great solution for that, because a lot of water gardeners, you have your koi pool and you have your plants, and those are separated because the koi can really do a number, especially on some of your more expensive, nice water lilies and other things that they, koi like to eat everything pretty much that's green. So any other pests, maybe some deer wandering in, anybody crazy coming in?
No, we have heron they're fishing now, but we don't really have anything with a heartbeat, I guess, that's giving us trouble. It's really just the fish, the muskrats, and we don't really see any human pressure. In other words, we don't have people that are coming along the creek and hassling with the plants. I mean, it used to be when it was laden with, we'd have a thick algae mat of 2 inches thick of algae, and it stunk, and people kind of looked at it like a sewer. They would throw in their cigarette butts and their, their cups, and you rarely see that today. I mean, things can blow in, but you don't see people treating it like a wastewater, which is certainly helpful.
That's wonderful to hear. And yeah, it's such a beautiful water garden. I can't even imagine throwing debris into it. But occasionally, of course, debris blows in and leaves can get in. The plants themselves shed. So there's always that kind of layer of debris and sludge at the bottom. Do you guys muck it out once a year? Do you lower the water or ever drain it totally?
Yeah, no, I mean that would require like taking this thing down 3 feet and then bringing in, front end loaders, big heavy
Hmm.
equipment to do a demucking. I think just by walking around, I mean, when we first started, you'd walk and you get this really bad smell, like almost like methane, because what all that lived were the anaerobic on the built up of the organic materials, and it really stunk. And that's not the case anymore. But no, we don't demuck it, and there is, it's actually kind of beautiful because we have enough flow that we keep about a foot and a half gutter, if you will, where we don't have any plant material on the surface on both sides. And so what happens if things blow in, or like you say, there's some dead material, it'll actually, the water garden will clear itself.
Hmm.
We're not in it, which is something I certainly didn't realize, along with a lot of other things when we started. But we do our best to keep all the water plants back from the edge to allow this sort of self-cleaning mechanism. And every time there's a rainstorm, we get hundreds of thousands of gallons of water will still come down that channel, and it'll clear the garden out. It also, unfortunately, it'll lower the water temperature by about 5 degrees, which is pretty dramatic. And that's, I think, one of the reasons we had so much trouble with Victoria, because you could go from 78 degrees to 73 or 75 down to 70 degrees in a matter of hours. Because you have to think about rain falls at, almost, it can fall at temperatures down to 34 degrees, right? And so it can, if you get enough water at that temperature, you can dramatically change the temperature of the water column that you're planted in. So this isn't something that most people have to worry about, but because we're a flood control project, that's somewhat what's one of the realities we had to deal with. And as I said, I didn't know about this, obviously. I didn't know so much about this when we started. If I had, I probably wouldn't have started it. But I mean, ignorance is bliss, as they say. So
Yes, and we're so glad you did. And I do want to mention, because it's moving water and you have there's like water fountains, kind of water spillage in some areas, kind of looks like, small waterfalls. It keeps the water moving, and that eliminates really any chance of mosquitoes, because I know that would be a lot of
yeah,
questions about, is this breeding mosquitoes?
right. And I think I think the main thing is the fish, right?
Hmm.
And you can buy little mosquito fish, but anytime you have a fair amount of fish, they're going to eat the larvae. And like in my own backyard pond, which is, still, as well as in this pond, you really don't see mosquitoes as a problem.
I feel as long as the water is moving, you're good. And as you said, you have a good balance. Everything kind of is in its own life cycle and balances itself out, which is wonderful. And I find water features to be the best thing for attracting birds and wildlife to your garden. So I know a lot of people go to Color on the Creek just for the bird watching and, of course, relax and enjoy the beauty of it. Is there any other side benefits for this project that have come up over the years that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, I mean, when we started, we didn't realize that there would be an economic benefit to Frederick. I mean, it wasn't on our radar, but Frederick now, I think, makes about $560 million a year on tourism. And we've been told by people in the Economic Development Council, the mayor, that the water garden and then the boats, which we really haven't talked about, those are the two main attractions downtown. So I don't know what percentage of that money is attributable to the garden, but it's certainly something that if any of our listeners are thinking about doing something like this, there is potentially an economic benefit. And if you need to raise money, you could go to your local businesses or town fathers, whatever, and say, we think this might actually bring people that are then going to shop and go to restaurants and use the hotels, and I think that that's something that we didn't expect. And I think the other thing is just that it brings people together. I think there are so many things, that are political that sort of drive people apart, all sorts of different reasons. And I think something like this, which is inert ideologically, so to speak. I mean, how do you not like a water garden, right? Or whatever, a terrestrial garden, a water garden. And I think it's just something that brings people together as they walk along the creek. The beauty of this particular project is it's open 24/7, right? And so people can do their morning walk or run, jog down along the creek, or they can, come down for lunch, or they just stroll at dinner or go to the restaurants. And so it really it's not 24/7 that I would say there's usage, but it's 18 hours a day. There are people down there, depending on the weather, but it's kind of, it becomes an enriched town square. And that's, again, not something that I really thought about when we started this. It was really about tackling the algae problem. So yeah, it's like everything in life. There are spin-offs you don't think about.
Yep. And I would say there are some very lucky individuals who have, their homes back onto the creek, and I'm sure their real estate value has gone up. I've seen Color on the Creek be the cover story of local Frederick publications, so it's definitely a huge driver of the tourism. And let's talk about what happens when there isn't the water garden. So we mentioned the boats.
Yeah, so maybe 3 years after we started the water garden, 3 or 4, in 2016, I had an idea to put some boats in, sort of mirroring what they were doing in Annapolis. They have this parade of lights where, it's usually a weekend maybe, and they have these boats that you can see from land. And there are other places throughout the United States and the world have done similar things. But I thought that the environment, the Color in the Creek promenade, was really ideal for this, and we could have a much more extended use of the water above the dormant water garden during the winter months, and to bring people back into town and along the creek. And so we started with one boat. My son actually was in the military, and it was a little bit of an homage to him. And then we expanded that over the years. We're up to about 30 boats now, and each of these boats they're moored down a series of anchors that sit right atop the water garden, and they're all lit up literally 24/7 now for 3.5 months. And each of those boats is really kind of interesting to look at. They're all different teams that make them, different themes. They raise money for local charities. So there's, I don't know, 50 or so local charities that have benefited over the years. And we raise typically between $120,000 and $140,000 a year, which then go back to the sponsors of the boats. And the other thing we do is about 10% of the money raised for this event, it's called Sailing Through the Winter Solstice. 10% of that money then funds the entire water garden. So, if we make $140,000, we get $14,000 that goes to pay for all the plant material, the fertilizer, the waiters. If we want more stands, and so it's basically self-funded, the whole system. It's like the yin and the yang, right? We got the water garden, and then we got the boats, which pay for the water garden, and they both work together, and they're both actually, the people involved are, let's just say there's 10 core people for both of them, with about 70% overlap. People are doing both the water garden as well as the boats. But it's been it's been really nice, because then I'm not having to go out and hit up my friends and for money. And so that's worked out really well. And I think it's just a dark time of the year, right? And so it's nice to have these boats lit up. And now we have people coming up from certainly the Washington area. They come down from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and a lot of times they meet in Frederick. And every year they come back to see what's different on the boats. We have a system that allows the boats to turn over, so it's not the same boats every year, and that so it keeps it fresh. It keeps it lively. And I just think that there's so much beauty in public art. Like, you think about what you remember about a town. Like, if you went to Sydney, it's the Opera House, right? If you go to Paris, it might be the Eiffel Tower or the Stravinsky Garden, or the Space Needle in Seattle, whatever. I just think that having publicly accessible preferably free architecture or, gardens or, that kind of can make that town stick in your mind, and it's a place you want to go visit, right? So that's kind of how I look at it from the 30,000-foot view. Is it's just an attractive place to come to now.
Yeah, and I think you can, as you say, come back year after year, season after season, and it's just wonderful. Peter, how can our listeners contact you to find out more?
You can just email me. My email address is peterkramers55@gmail.com, and I'm happy to talk to anybody and share advice. And I've gotten a lot of free advice and wanting to pass it on.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter.
Well, thank you for doing this. I love your podcast.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
You mind if we make one more stop before heading back? I need to run a Target.
100%. Let's RTT. You thinking of stuff for the dorm?
Yeah, my mom gave me some good tips on must-have essentials. We for sure need underbed storage, handheld iron for wrinkles, maybe even a mini Keurig for Mondays. Am I right?
All right, bet. Because I was already thinking about keeping my clothes looking fresh at college, so you better be sharing that.
Of course, man. Whatever I get on this run is yours too.
Twin.
But for real, let's go before they close.
Find everything you need for college at Target.
Tomorrow morning is knocking. Stock your fridge now. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel, maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
Wine cups, plant profile. Wine cups, Caloroi and Volucrata, have dark pink chalice-shaped flowers that give them their common name. They are also known as purple poppy mallow, finger poppy mallow, or buffalo rose. The foliage resembles hardy geranium leaves, so the plant is often misidentified as being one. They are a mallow family relative and are native to central North America. Wine cups are hardy to USDA zones 4 to 8. They grow to about 1 foot high and 1 to 3 feet wide. They do best in full sun, planted in well-draining sandy or loamy soils, but can also tolerate clay soils. They are low-maintenance perennials that are drought-tolerant and heat-resistant. They were named a plant of merit by the Royal Horticultural Society. Wine cups can fit well in a mixed planting, weaving amongst other plants, or can be planted en masse to spill over a rock wall or front of a flower border. They attract many pollinators and are the larval host of the gray hair streak butterfly. They are deer-resistant and have few pest or disease issues. They can go dormant in summer after blooming, but will reemerge the following spring. They can be started from seeds, softwood cuttings, or purchased as small plants. They do not transplant well due to their deep tap root. Wine cups, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, I'm enjoying the blooms of my Weigelia shrubs. They're kind of reblooming a little bit early in the season, but still happy to see them. Joe Pieweed is just starting to bloom. Over at the community garden plot, I'm cutting Lisianthus annual flowers and bringing them into my desk and other indoor areas to enjoy inside. In garden tips that we shared this week, we talked all about water gardening, including to add barley straw in a bale or ball to your pond to improve water clarity. I want to thank all of those who voted for GardenDC. We made runner-up in the Best Local Podcast in the Best of DC annual voting hosted by Washington City Paper. And local gardening events, if you're in the Washington, D.C. region, you might want to attend the Smithsonian Family Day on Saturday, July 25th from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. It's being held on the National Mall and at the Arts and Industry Building in Enid Haupt Garden. You can join the Smithsonian for a one-day celebration for all ages, honoring America's 250th birthday, our founding, and our future. There will be events happening throughout the Smithsonian Garden, and you can celebrate a full day of discovery, creativity, and connection. This is free and open to all. And look out for an upcoming daylily sale. You can mark your calendar for Saturday, August 1st at McLean Nurseries in Parkville, Maryland. This is being hosted by the Free State Daylily Society. The event starts at 11 a.m. Bring a chair, cash, and a big bag because there will be so many daylilies out with outrageously low prices. You're going to walk away with many of them. So it culminates with an exciting daylily auction at the end. And then the DC Urban Gardener Network is hosting 4 online courses throughout 2026 growing season to teach everything needed to successfully grow food in the DC area. Course 3, Advanced Growing Techniques, has just been announced, and you can register for that through Doug DC Urban Gardening Network's website. Each class participant will receive recordings of each class in case you can't make it that day, and they meet every Tuesday from 6 to 8 p.m. from July 1st to September 8th. Topics include garden carpentry, winter growing and rooftop farming, urban fruit trees in DC, growing berries, cooking and preserving, urban cold composting and hot composting, growing mushrooms in the city, and more.
This is The Last Word by Christy Page at Green Prince with The Parsnip and the Pea by Lady Mo Pesco Hoyle. The soil quivered beneath her fingertips as the old woman knelt in the garden pulling weeds. Just as she wiped her brow and bent her ear to the ground, a small voice murmured from beneath the soil. "No more arguing about the rain, the worms, or the weeds that sometimes smother us," said the parsnip to the peanut. "We live in a warm, cozy patch, and yet you insist on bickering like feuding hens. Enough already." The old woman raised her head in disbelief. Had she been in the sun too long? Just then the petunias began waving their pointed leaves like scolding fingers at the periwinkles. "No more squabbling," they declared in their sweet, perfumed voices. "We leave that nonsense to the actual hens." Nearby, the peas were having what could only be described as a full-blown hissy fit at the peppers. "Stop pointing fingers. It's not our fault if our companion plants have strong opinions. We have no control over them, only over how we grow." The entire garden murmured in agreement. "We love our golden sun and rich crumbly soil," the plants chorused. "We adore the gourmet feast of compost and natural fertilizers our gentle gardener provides. She doesn't trouble us with the world's calamities. Instead, she sings to us in her soft, warbling voice, 'Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee.'" The old woman chuckled. If anyone had overheard, they might think she'd lost her mind. But did she care? Not an owl's hoot. "Our berry friends manage to get along just fine," the parsnip continued. "They may have thorns, but do they whine about it? No. They grow, they flourish, they sweeten the world. So why should the rest of you complain? You're given the best of care." a garden's quiet counsel. The passing breeze whispered through the leaves, carrying the delicate fragrance of citrus blossoms and jasmine vines. The parsnip sighed and spoke once more. We should all learn to listen, to be still, to grow with calmness of spirit. Fussing and fidgeting wastes the energy we need to flourish. The petunias nodded, rustling in agreement. Every living thing, be it plant, animal, or human, should be honored for its own way of growing and being. All that exists was made and loved, added the periwinkles. We should all respect that. It's far easier to bloom in harmony than to tangle in discord. A hush fell over the garden. The old woman sat back on her heels, smiling. What simple sage wisdom! If only the world beyond her garden listened as well as these plants. Then, just as peace settled in, a voice broke the silence. Said the tomato to the tulip, "You know, I've been thinking." "Hush up, Tom," groaned a chorus of crimson clematis. "Let us have our peace." The old woman threw back her head and laughed. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at greenprints.com.
Thank you for listening to Garden DC. This episode was made by real humans. It was produced and hosted by myself, Kathy Jentz. The Let the Sunshine music interludes are by James Mulvaney. If you like this episode, you may also enjoy listening to Garden DC Podcast, Episode 248, Water Garden Plants with Suzanne Boom. Episode 11, Lotus with Kelly Billing. Episode 63, Water Gardening and Koi Ponds. Episode 228, Reducing Runoff with Rain Gardens. You can become a listener supporter by going to the link in our show notes. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Pinterest at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast listening app. Please take a moment to share us on social media with hashtag GardenDC and with your gardening friends so other gardeners can find us too. Happy gardening!